I am absolutely delighted that he has agreed to come to Arizona. I know that I have learned a lot just from having dinner with him last night, and I know that all of you are going to learn a lot about a different problem with marijuana. And our next speaker is Dr. Mourad Gabriel. He co-founded the Integral Ecology Research Center in 2004. He earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in Wildlife Biology at Humboldt State University, his Master's in Wildlife Ecology at Humboldt State University, and then his PhD in Comparative Pathology with an emphasis on wildlife disease ecology at the University of California, Davis at the School of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Gabriel is also a research associate faculty at the One Health Institute Wildlife Health Center at the University of California, Davis. So let's give Dr. Gabriel a warm welcome from Arizona.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I, again, would like to extend my appreciation for the invitation to present what I feel would at least relay what we are experiencing in California and what may be potentially occurring also in other parts of this union regards to marijuana cultivation. And I apologize for the slide, and the specific example is because of the word cannabis is in here. And the reason why is I actually had to change it. This is a slide I had to change in California because in California it's actually frowned upon if you were to use the word marijuana because it's racially profiling. And so that's, and so we have, so I apologize on that one. But also the other issue too, and what Sergeant Gerhardt mentioned is very key, what's occurring not in Colorado as well, but also occurring in California. And this is, even though it's not topic related for my specific talk, but a good example is I live in Humboldt County. So if anybody knows Humboldt County is essentially in the lion's den, the Emerald Triangle. And so we have private cultivation, permitted or unpermitted. We have trespass cultivation. We have it all. A great example is our homicide rate. From 1986 to 2013, for a county that is close to 200 square miles, is essentially in less than about 95,000 people. From 86 to 2013 was 8 average homicides a year. 2014 and 15, it went from 15 to 17. 2016, we have 22. And 2017, we're expected to probably hit between 22 and 25 homicides in that time period. And also talking about what happens for a community, just in where I live at, in our hill, we have about 44 houses, all within a quarter acre to a half an acre on this little area surrounded by private timberlands. Out of about 45 houses, 25 of those are cultivating marijuana. Just to drive from my house to 3-4 miles to go to drop off my children, we have 3 billboards that are all pro-marijuana. And so again, that is what we're seeing. That's what we have in my community. So I implore you, if you want to see what happens in a community that is 100% complacent and you don't want this to transpond into your community, please come to Humboldt County, and it will definitely change your mind. Even though there's a lot of folks that are saying this is so beneficial, I have yet to see a benefit yet. With that, what I'm going to be focusing on this talk is looking at the environmental contamination and the impacts that have arisen because of the marijuana cultivation, the illicit marijuana cultivation that is just running rampant right now in California. So the canary in the cannabis field or the marijuana field, essentially looking how this fisher, which is a species of special concern, illuminated this. So out of curiosity, who here knows what a fisher is? Just raise your hand. Okay, few. Okay, and I won't ask the next question is how many of you have seen a fissure? That's a California question. So fissure is a rare mid-sized mesocarnivore. So they're relatives to marten, wolverine, river otters, sea otters, or mustelid, so a weasel in the weasel family. They're about the size of a pretty good sized large house cat. And just a little bit of a really interesting life history trait is they're the only species in North America that could actively and effectively kill porcupines without ever receiving a quill. And the reason why is because they're so agile that they'll actually kill a porcupine by scratching its face, then jumping on the tree while the porcupine flips to throw some quills out, and then do the same thing over and over and over again until it exsanguinates that porcupine, and they'll eat it from the bottom up. So that's how pretty much they're like wolverines, pound for pound. The other thing is fissures reside in mid to late cereal stage forest. So if you're not familiar with the life history traits for fissures, is then think about spotted owls. Do you remember in the 80s and 90s, the huge logging issues with either Mexican spotted owls or California, the northern spotted owls, that whole issue there with a teeny species in the ESA, is they live in these mid to late cereal stage forest. So when you think about marijuana or you think about fissures, they shouldn't be synonymous with each other because we're talking rural, remote areas. We're not talking about a coyote wandering in a downtown urban setting. So in 2004, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service essentially placed the fissure as a candidate species under the Endangered Species Act. And the reason why, as you can see, is that historically is the gray area. That's where fissures used to reside. Now, there's various threat factors, so overexploitation of the species for its pelt, also overharvesting of timber in those areas, so that it's actually contracted. In some areas, they've actually been fully extirpated or extinct. So what happened was in 2004, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service essentially stated that we need to find out what is potentially a limiting factor for fissures. And if disease or other factors, human-made factors, are a potential threat. Now, bear in mind, 2004, marijuana was not on my radar. I never sought out to do this. I didn't get student loans or incur student loans in order to study marijuana. That's not what I did. And so we started looking. We were funded by Fish and Wildlife Service to try to investigate what the disease threat. So we were thinking about canine parvovirus, distemper virus, roadkill, all these other factors that are been front and center for other carnivores. Are these also impacting fissures? So this is what we usually do. Prior to started doing this research. So our organization and our collaborators, we do molecular ecology. You can see in some of these photos here. And that's pretty much some of our scientific team. Here we are with the bobcat, collaring a bobcat, trying to find out how many bobcats kill deer fawns, how many bobcats will kill X, Y, or Z species, where on the landscape bobcats work. Again, nothing marijuana related. That's not what we sought out to do. As scientists, we're being objective and wanted to focus on conservation issues. But in 2009, again, we're doing necropsies, which would be synonymous to an autopsy for a human. So, myself as a comparative pathologist, wildlife disease ecologist, been working with a board-certified pathologist. Every fissure in the state of California was coming to our lab at UC Davis. And we were doing necropsies on these individuals, which would be, again, the pathology, but also ancillary testing, which would be toxicology. So we were getting fissures prior to 2009, roadkill, killed by a mountain lion, killed by a bobcat, killed by a coyote. For us, it was like, okay, this is interesting, and we keep on going forward. Here we have a healthy male fissure. It died, looks completely intact. We recover it, and I'm like, oh, this looks like possibly a disease, like maybe distemper, something quick, fast that dropped it really quickly. This fissure, remember, we have GPS and radio collars, so we know exactly. So that kind of this, again, the scientific objectiveness where, oh, can you really relate that to where the fissure was versus we know where this fissure was born and we know where it lived because of the GPS tracking, where it was continuously through the landscape until it died. So this fissure lived on public lands. Yosemite National Park was part of his territory, and then Sierra National Forest, 100% public land. The necropsy said, you've got rat bait, rat poison, completely on board. So when we did the necropsy on this individual, I mean, if you know the clinical pathology or the manifestations that occur with rodenticide toxicosis, you essentially bleed out to death. So when we did the necropsy, you have coagulopathy or just excessive blood loss in all the cavities. Thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity, and then you have blood loss coming out of the ears, nose, any orifice, blood was leaking out of this fissure. So that was a huge thing because number one, remember, is rat bait, rat poison supposed to be used in these remote public lands? No. And we started inquiring. We went to the utility companies. Are you using rodenticide out there? Are you placing it out for power poles? And the answer was no. We went to the National Park Service, Forest Service, campgrounds, the concessions at Yosemite National Park, and they said, no, it's illegal for us to use this and disperse this. Campgrounds, from even outside of these areas, we started asking questions, and the answer was constantly no, no, no. So we didn't have an answer at that point. But what I want to kind of highlight before I start diving into this data is that, as a quote from Rachel Carson from Silent Spring, where she states, we urgently need to end the sugarcoating of unpalatable facts. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can do so only when in full possession of the facts. And that's one thing as a scientist that I see is there's a lot of ill-informed decisions that aren't based off of sound scientific principles. Just because the data is lacking or not present doesn't mean it negates there's maybe a deleterious impact. And that's what we've been seeing because the topic of marijuana cultivation and environmental impacts unfortunately has been emotionally charged and sensationalized, but a complete lacking of scientific facts. And that's what I'm presenting here at this talk, and that's what I've been doing also in our research and our work, is validating it with peer-reviewed publications and facts. So what we did, again, is we published this paper. So we went ahead and compiled the data of all the fishers that have died from 2009 to 2012. And you can see that's pretty much, it's a course title for our paper. But it's a scientific peer-reviewed title, a manuscript. It's been if folks who may not be familiar with the process of peer review for scientific literature is that we submit this manuscript, we submit it to a publication, and they submit it out to or disseminate it out to 4 independent reviewers that are subject matter experts. They don't have to be marijuana. None of them were marijuana experts. They're experts on toxicology and experts on that species, an expert in human wildlife dimensions. They submit it globally. We go ahead and receive the critical commentary and have to revise our manuscript based off of that commentary. Now, with that stated is what we've been doing is publishing all of this information in an open access journal. So we avoid this caveat of, you know what, I have a PhD, I'm only going to publish in the ivory tower in these journals where you have to pay $5,000 for a subscription. Well, I look at it as we receive public funding, then I go ahead and publish this in an open access journal. Then all that journal also publishes our raw data. And I invite anybody out there to criticize our raw data and do a rebuttal. Because we go ahead and look at it as our science should stand still and we shouldn't be coveted or guarded with our data. We invite people to be critical of it. But this was published in 2012, and we still yet to have somebody rebut this. And we do have received commentary, but it's all in blogs and non-scientific and objective. But with this publication, we had 4 fishers that died. Bear in mind, California, it's estimated that in some of the subpopulations of fishers, there's only 100 individuals left. And what worries us is this is a non-natural mortality. So we had 4 fishers die to a non-natural mortality from rat bait being placed out there. We had 79% of fishers that were exposed. So this is all fishers in the state of California would be monitored by a 79% exposure rate, with an average of 1.61 different types of rodenticide. And we actually had 1 fisher kit, so this is its offspring, exposed to rodenticide. That fisher was altricial, which means that it was 100% dependent on its mother's milk, which means that it was exposed to via either in utero, in the womb, or exposed to through its mother's milk, which has been documented in experimental studies, but now we have documentation that this is occurring in the wild. So you can see there, now we have wildlife that we are spending millions and millions of dollars to try to conserve that are being exposed to a toxicant being utilized on marijuana cultivation sites. We again hit it home, strike when the nail's hot, okay? So we put another paper out, conservation letters here. Again, impacts of rodenticides and insecticide toxicants from marijuana cultivation sites on your public lands. And what we found out was a fisher, which has a very small territory size, so we're not talking mountain lion or black bear, which, huge territory size. We're talking about, a very small territory. Had an average of 5.3 different marijuana grow sites in its territory. When we looked at a fisher that was exposed versus non-exposed, a significant difference, 4 versus 0.6. So that, again, that demonstrated clearly that if you had grow sites in your that was kind of more of the smoking gun. You had grow sites present wherever you walked and tried to go get food, you were most likely going to be exposed to these toxicants. We had 1 fisher that had 16 marijuana cultivation sites. Bear in mind, folks, we're not talking about a private cultivation. We're talking about trespass cultivation on your public lands. And bear in mind, too, remember 1996, Proposition 215 passed, and then we had SB 420, and then now we just had Proposition 64. So remember, black market's supposed to be 100% invalid now. But we're now dealing with a fisher that has 16 active grow sites out there. So that kind of illuminated another issue, is that we're trying to look at, and this is a great quote from a naturalist, John Muir, is when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else. So as you know, when you have a roof that's leaking, you're kind of looking up and going, okay, what's going on up there? That could be a serious, serious issue. And that leads us to exactly like the fisher. The fisher was at Canary in that cannabis or marijuana field, where we're now having fishers that were dying and exposed at a significant rate. I'll give you a little bit of background too. When we published that first paper in 2012, 2 of the reviewers said, your data is flawed because there's absolutely no way, and your results and your testing must be flawed, because there's no way fishers were exposed at 79% rate. You have fishers that are higher exposed to these pesticides than coyotes in downtown LA or barn owls that were living in downtown Sacramento. So there's no way. But the lab we're using is an EPA and a California state certified laboratory. So again, we were trying to demonstrate this. That's how surprising it was. But now the fisher essentially became that canary in the marijuana field that was demonstrating larger ramifications to the environment from this deleterious event that was occurring, which was marijuana cultivation. So the next question was, what about other species? How about the abiotic or biotic samples like water and soil, or plants? How about humans, community members, and law enforcement? Sergeant Gerhardt alluded to it in his questions, but just FYI, some of the things that we're doing with law enforcement is, and I don't know if you're familiar, but California, U.S. Forest Service got hit with a willful OSHA violation because 2 of their officers, one went into a coma and got hospitalized, another officer is on disabled right now because they worked in marijuana cultivation sites and they got exposed to numerous different toxicants, which I'm going to explain here. So that's something that we do too, is also training to how to avoid that chemical bullet. It's very similar to a Klan lab. And we go through medical surveillance just because of the level of chemicals that are out there. So it was a really great question when we started in the beginning is, what about community members? Those of you who interact out there in the wild and go ahead and go hunting, fishing, take your kids out there, pump water from a creek, or law enforcement who has to go out there and eradicate these plants. So the next thing we did was apply for a grant. This is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funding, and you can see some of our collaborators here, both from state and federal partners as well as other NGOs. And we wanted to look at this. We wanted to tease out, build up that empirical data instead of anecdotal data on this material. So remember I showed you that earlier photo? This is now how we have to collect data out there. We are working with federal, state law enforcement officers. We are also working with U.S. Army Special Forces as well as counter-drug. That's why we have to do this, because there's been numerous instances where we've been shot at, or there's numerous instances where we go into a grow site and we run into 20 to 30 armed cultivators. And we only go in with an insertion team of 2 LEOs in order to collect the data. And this site was supposed to be vacant. So that's what we're running into. A great example too, which was a little bit of a red flag for me early on. If you look at this individual right here, so this individual is actually federal Congressman Jared Huffman. And you have a counter-drug military individual as well as a state conservation officer. Everybody is wearing bulletproof vests and plates. Everybody else who is not is the science team. So that was kind of one of those things. That was a key thing, is like, hey, you know, everybody's got a gun. Everybody is wearing plates, and you know, I'm the scientist who's going to be buried down trying to get this data. But we've got individuals with handguns and long guns running everywhere. So, but again, what I want to illustrate here in this photo is, we're not working in Central America here. We are talking about, you know, mine and your national forest lands, your state park lands. So when you think of Yosemite National Park, these are some of the areas that we're going in there, just right outside of Yosemite National Park. So that's what has happened in California. In fact, we have policy for our teams. They carry a can of mace. They carry a spot tracking system, and we also embed in their clothing basically a VHF transponder. We have to do that because there's many times that have happened to other collaborators where they're being chased by going out there to go count frogs, being chased by armed cultivators that are out there, and they're dropping everything on them to just be able to run away. And so that's why we sew VHF transponders in clothing, because we want to be able to at least do some tracking if that occurs. But this is, again, this is in California on your public lands. So, but at the same time too, this is a member of the Special Forces who accompanied us, but I would say right now that we still try to have fun. Okay, so even though it may be a little bit probably dangerous, more dangerous than your average standard ecologist work, but we have a great science team that tries to put a smile on it, because it's really, I think it's cutting edge conservation work that's been occurring here in North America. So what does marijuana cultivation look like? This is pretty much what we run into constantly. So it's a fragmented landscape, and this is just, I think, about 1,500 plant grow. This is about 3,500 plant grow, but this is an intact forest. There's the creek running right through here, and they removed all the trees and growing on there. That is a 50,000 plant grow. So when I say 15 or 2,000 or 5,000 plants, bear in mind that you're talking about from top to bottom is 3 miles long on a drainage. Multiple cultivation plots, 50,000 plants, 80,000 plants. The biggest grow I've ever been to was about 105,000 plants. But and it spanned, I think it was about 6 or 7 miles along the drainage. So when you have a law enforcement team that's going to do an eradication on these grow sites, this isn't a one-day operation. So they have to reserve it, where we have the bird for only 3 days, but we just hit one grow that is 50,000 plants that's going to take us 3 days to eradicate. But we know about 10 other grows out there. But we can only put our effort into that one grow. So those other 10 grows just go. Nothing gets addressed. So it's free and clear. And that's occurring. Again, when I'm talking about that is the lack of support to our LEO agencies to address this. Because again, when you go to California, people have this mindset that it isn't occurring, and it's organic, and it's just a plant. And as Sergeant Gerhardt mentioned too, is people go ahead and mention to them, why are you going after these individuals? You should really be doing your work going after murderers and other, white dope. So what does a campsite look like? That's a campsite on your top, and there's a trash dump on your bottom. So that's me digging into a trash dump. So that's how deep it was. We dug into there, and it turned out to be about 8 to 10 feet deep. That's how amount of trash is there. And that's not just one trash pit. We're talking about 5 or 6 trash pits. We're talking about an average of 4 to 6 individuals to upwards of 20 to 28 individuals at a grow site for 4, 5, 6 months at a time. So imagine you have no septic system. You have 10 individuals eating daily, defecating right next to a creek shed, okay? And you have a campground half a mile below that, and you're going to pump water, to give it to your kid. That's what's occurring out there. And I just mentioned it earlier, is that I bring all of my water. Even if I go for an 8 to 10 hour day, if I can't put the water in my pack, I'm not tapping into any water supply there. And I'll explain why, and you'll see some of the data of why I have that justification. What does source line look like? That's the amount of irrigation line that is coming out to feeding a grow site. So it's extensive. It's actually very disgusting when you see agencies spend millions of dollars to conserve an endangered salmon, and they're doing everything they can to conserve this endangered salmon, but then right above all of these conservation projects that are instilled, you have 20, 30 grow sites that are completely 100% dewatering a stream. So I've always posed it as we need to address this new conservation threat and issue. So now, next question, is it getting better? Are exposures and deaths from grow sites contaminants decreasing? Because remember, we published in 2012, we did another publication in 2013, another one in 2 and 14. So we had 4 publications focusing only on this, all peer-reviewed scientific publications. We've done numerous talks, numerous media events out there to convey our scientific data. And so we thought, oh, it's all going to go away. This is what's going to happen. It's just like anything else. Public awareness, people don't agree with it. You may get the denial, the anger, but now acceptance, and now we're going to have a solution and a resolution towards it. So we published another paper in 2015. Remember, we had 4 deaths, now we had 9 deaths. But bear in mind, that publication is 2012, and this publication only focused for about 1.5 years to 2 years of data. It went from 79% to 85% exposure. Went from 1.6 to 1.73. Now, when you look at mortality, previously we were documenting fishers that were dying. An average annual mortality rate was 5.6% of fishers. It went 233% increase to 18.7%. Now, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of different agencies stated that if you have an additive mortality, so additive mortality would be a non-natural mortality. If you died of a disease or you died by getting killed by a predator, that's a natural mortality. You got hit by a Subaru Crosstrek, driving on the road, that's an additive, a non-natural mortality. So rat bait, which is a human-derived toxicant, is a non-natural mortality. And the agency stated that if you had an average mortality of 10% or more, your population will decrease. And boom, we're at 18.7%. We're 8% above that critical threshold that will deplete that population to the rate of extinction. And that additive mortality is specific because of the toxicants used at marijuana cultivation sites. So again, empirical data, empirical evidence, and just like Sergeant Gerhardt mentioned too, if you go to the media, there's individuals that say, the cop that gets paid, and there's also the scientist that's a stooge for law enforcement. That's what I've been coined as well. But I look at it and go, well, my data's out there, and it's open access, which means please take the raw data, go ahead and do some magical statistical analysis that we don't know about, and prove us wrong. I invite you. That's the way I work. Though with that, look at this. We're talking 14 months of data. That's all we added to this. And now we have all fishers that we have tested are exposed to this rat bait. We have now have 4 new mortality deaths. We have a bottle of champagne ready to pop open when we get our next fisher that is not contaminated. I mean, that's our celebration. We want a fisher that's not contaminated, that's removed from your public lands. I shouldn't be saying this, but that's what's occurring. So now we know fishers are exposed. What route? Is it primary or secondary poisoning? Well, we wanted to figure that out. So what we did was we started putting remote camera systems. So you may know a lot of this from game cameras. They're pretty much exactly the same. We tweak them a little bit more, but we put cameras out there because, number one, a lot of individuals are saying, well, fishers were getting it from someone else. Are you guys going out there and throwing this bait out there? And I said, hey guys, we found this out in 2009. I didn't even, ever use rat bait before 2009. So how would I start dispersing that? Is law enforcement doing this? Fishers, are they going ahead and, finding dead fishers and, putting rat bait down their throat and basically having this? I mean, all of these, kind of conspiracy theories were coming out there. So we wanted to document are fishers actively interacting at these grow sites that are contaminated. We put hundreds of cameras out there at grow sites. So this would be a grow site that law enforcement eradicated, all the poisons are still out there, or the poisons were removed. We put cameras out there, and before the next growing season when the cultivators came in, we wanted to find out. And this is what happened. So here is a great example. This is a grow site, and you have the toxicants there. That's how much rat bait would be found at one grow site. That's the amount of food that's present there. Hot dogs, eggs. Put the cameras up, and guess what we would find? A fisher. That's at the same grow site. So that's where all those poisons would have been. Now here, you can see all these toxicants. You can see that flat bed. Look at the trees. There's a flat area right there. In that same area, a fisher. But it's not just fishers. We're also finding other species. So here is a black bear with her cubs, bringing them in. So you guys know the old, it's for game and fish or fish and wildlife that if a fed bear is a dead bear. Now imagine this. We have thousands of sites in California, and we have all of this food. All these bears are coming in, and they're now interacting with all of these chemicals. So not just one fisher, multiple fishers. So these are all different grow sites where we would find fishers. So it was pretty clear to us that, we have now the evidence and the data to demonstrate that fishers are actually going into these grow sites searching for food items and then now going to be consuming all of the pesticides that these cultivators placed out there. Well, I'm a hunter. Before we had a little one, my wife and I used to probably put about 60 to 75% of all our food products from items that we'd hunt or garden. That's the way our family works. Now it's probably down to 40%, but I wanted to find out, well, is it game? I see game all the time in these grow sites. And look at this bear right here. This bear is in a grow site. That's what it's rummaging through. It's actually touching tons and tons of different toxicants mixed with hot dogs and eggs and other types of food products. So I wanted to find out, is the game that I'm harvesting in these areas potentially contaminated? And this is another, that's a mule deer in a coveted hunt zone in California. Again, bear in mind, California, that's a huge deer. Okay, for you guys in Arizona or in other states, that's, that's a button buck. But for us, that's a coveted hunt zone. People will have to wait 7 years to get the tag for this particular hunt zone. And here's a deer interacting in that same growth site. And I have thousands and thousands of these photos and videos of these game species there. But we wanted to find this out. So we partnered up with the Mule Deer Foundation. And what we did was we focused on hunters, and we didn't want to go ahead and say we wanted the individuals that are going to drive in the back of their F-150 and just tag a deer off the back of their pickup truck. What we did was we focused on pack hunters. So we went into archery hunters. And again, we're throwing a dart at a very far object and seeing if it sticks. We didn't want to get something where someone shot a deer right outside of a city limits. We wanted individuals that are only going to hunt in wilderness areas, and they're going to use pack horses to go in 5 to up to 10 miles deep into the wilderness to harvest a deer or an elk or a bear or other species. And we wanted to test the meat and see if that meat is contaminated. Well, 1 out of 22 deer. And that individual consumed that meat, and again, he asked me the question, and I said, well, listen, I have a PhD, I'm not an MD, and therefore you need to talk to your physician to see, if that could potentially, but what I can tell you as a scientist is the fishers are exposed, the fishers are dying because they're a carnivore. They're eating other species that are contaminated. So if you are a hunter and you're eating contaminated game product, I can't answer that question if you are being exposed, but based off of the clinical manifestations that occur with it, there is the possibility. So that's a very guarded way of going about it. But we also found mountain quail and black bears that were positive. Again, these are all hunter harvested. And unfortunately, the mountain quail, that story is actually a very close and personal story because I love to hunt quail. And so my wife and I, with our daughter, went and busted up a covey, harvested the quail, and my wife's going, hey, do you think quail are exposed? And I'm like, I don't know. And I pulled a couple pieces of meat off, set it off to the side, submitted to the lab. We ate the stew. Lab results come back a month later and said, that quail meat that you submitted was positive. But again, that's me, my wife, and my child now have consumed contaminated meat. But again, you have other quail, other bears, and deer now positive. So that raises that issue if that's a human health concern. So spotted owls. You know how much money and controversies for spotted owls. Huge. And I know you guys had an issue here in Arizona, but California as well. So we looked at surrogates where barred owls were coming in and encroaching on spotted owl habitat and territories. So we wanted to look, and they're removing them. So they're shooting barred owls to remove them so that spotted owls can rebound. They harvested 158. We tested the tissue, 56% of barred owls. Spotted owls, we have 10. 70% of them were exposed to rodenticides. And we know where they lived, and they lived in these remote areas. Now you're talking about owls that people spend, millions of dollars per owl, and they're exposed to now these chemicals being used by marijuana cultivators. It's a paper that's going to be coming out in probably a month or two, so be aware that that's probably going to cause a huge storm when we go ahead and have this paper published, and we're going to say that. And what we basically stated in there was that this now, because where these owls were harvested was not just on public land, but these owls were collected and harvested on private timberlands that are surrounded by private inholdings that have unpermitted or permitted grows. But because, and this is part of the discussion point, is because of the lack of enforcement or regulations in the monitoring of these private lands, that our source points for exposures now have swayed into and have moved into the private land cultivation as well as suspicious to be source points. So that's going to be a huge thing. But I think that's going to be a great discussion point is if you're not regulating it, you're not enforcing it, no one's monitoring it, how do you know these private growers are stating that we are not using these chemicals at all? So now the data is demonstrating ongoing and escalating exposures and mortality from food web contamination. What we don't know is what specific chemicals they're using out there. We know they're using rat bait, but we wanted to find out, get more empirical evidence on that. And then also, what are the quantities? How much are they using it? Is it just like a teaspoon of it, or are they using gallons of it? So what we did was we started training and going in with law enforcement. So there's just a select group of us in our science team that have been trained with law enforcement to go into entry days, and we go ahead and grade day zero documentation of a grow site the way a grower would leave it behind. So we go in and you can see we have public lands and we have private timberlands and tribal lands, and this is all throughout Northern California. This is per site out of those 77. So this is data from 77. Now, if you were to ask me the question, how many data points does the state or the federal agencies have? 0. So this is the first time we started tackling this. And it was kind of surprising that there's no other data sets to do this. But this is per site. Look how much fertilizer they're using. An average of over 1,200 pounds of soluble fertilizer. Now, when I talk about liquid fertilizer, that may not look like a lot, like 1,300 ounces. But bear in mind that if you've ever worked in investigated fertilizers that they use, the liquid fertilizers for cultivation, it's concentrated. So 1 ounce can be reconstituted to 100 or 500 gallons of workable fertilizer. But when we found over 1,000, we're talking an average of 5,000 to upwards of 10,000 gallons of liquid fertilizer that's being applied per grow site. These are also concentrated chemicals. So carbamates, you may be familiar with carbofuran, which is the pink stuff. That is a carbamate. Organophosphates, look at how many ounces. And again, these are concentrated. So a good example is a carbamate. When we find an average carbamate, it would be 1 ounce to 50 gallons. So when you have 48 ounces out there, you're talking of hundreds of gallons being applied of one type of chemical family. Now look at that list. These are all the different types of rat bait that are being placed out there per grow site. That's the average. And that's the type of snail bait to kill the snails. So that is a toxicant slurry that is being placed out there per site. Here's the other thing is we're finding out of the 77 locations, 35% had banned or restricted use pesticide. What I mean by banned is that these pesticides have been banned by EPA or the state agency, and most of them where we're finding are banned from the EPA for any legal use in the union or within that state. So you cannot use it, you can't distribute it, you can't even be in possession of them, and we're finding it. But unfortunately, we'll go into a grow site and we won't find any of these chemicals. So we won't find a banned chemical, the bottle, the physical bottle of that chemical. But when we test the plants, or we test the soil, or we take a swab of a sprayer, we take it back to our lab, our laboratory results will then come back and say, you've got X, Y, or Z chemical. We go ahead and cross-reference it, and these are banned chemicals. So a lot of it, and this goes back to law enforcement, the safety out there. Just because you don't see it, because you don't see the physical bottle, that soil may be contaminated with that banned chemical. Those plants that you're eradicating may be contaminated. These chemicals are systemic pesticides, which means that they sequester in the phloem or the xylem, which is essentially the sap of that material. So in California, we have completely stopped ever using machetes. OSHA and Cal-OSHA now mandates that all law enforcement officers have to use long-handled shears to cut the marijuana because the sap is contaminated. And how many of you have ever eradicated plants will go ahead and cut, put your machete in your sheath? How many of you decontaminate those machetes afterwards? No one probably. And then, or your gloves, and your gloves are so sticky you can throw them on a window and they'll stick. All of that leads to an exposure, and just like anything with pesticides, if your glove is contaminated and you don't wash it and you put it in your back pocket, you are going to be exposed, and you could have some deleterious health impacts in the future. Other thing that we're noticing too is unknown substances that have been repurposed in containers. This is a Gatorade bottle, a water bottle, a water bottle. That's what we find. We find the stuff pink. We have now found strawberry yogurt bottles that have been repurposed with a pink stuff. I notice it by being in hundreds of sites, notice that's a different coloration than that pink stuff. We have also a reference laboratory, visual and other reference laboratory, where we train everybody to have a visual situational awareness of what they're running into at a grow site. And that's what I look at that and I go, you know, I've never seen a Gatorade in that color. So it's an automatic key thing. But if you touch that, and I'll go into that, the chemical in there is highly, highly lethal. What we still don't know is the water below grow sites contaminated. I alluded to that, and I also alluded to soil as well. So we monitored water courses below 14 grow site complexes. So, and we actually just started a project right now. We're going to be monitoring 50 grow sites in one county. We're going to start monitoring grow sites, trespass grow sites and private land grow sites, and we're doing this in the county, and we're going to be looking at fertigation and toxicant risk. But we monitored 14 in this study. 50% of those watersheds were just pulsing toxicants, and the majority of those were restricted and banned chemicals. So when I say this, I'm talking about a chemical that has been banned by EPA because it is deleterious to human health and environmental health. And it has been banned because it's highly lethal, acutely toxic. So when I go ahead and detect these chemicals and I notify the municipality, hey, I detected chemical 1 and it's banned. Have you screened it and found it in your water supply that's going out to your community? And they get back to me and say, why would I do that? It's illegal to use that chemical. We only test for legal chemicals or other chemicals that are restricted that people would apply. You know, we're not in the San Joaquin Valley where it's agriculture. But now this is a new reality. And other individuals that are tapping into some of these watersheds, you know, in these rural areas, they don't have water that's coming in from a municipality. They're getting their spring water or their creek water, and they have different filtration devices. Anything that you buy from Cabela's, your filtration devices for when you go backpacking, will not filter out pesticides. They'll filter out protozoan and bacteria, but they do not filter out pesticides. You have to have a military grade filter in order to do that. And so think about it, when a lot of these watersheds I looked at after I got this data, and that's what I mentioned that, because I would go out, work a site for 10, 12 hours, and I don't want to carry 2 gallons of water for a 12-hour, 90-day hike. So I would only get a water bottle, go up to the next creek, pump it up, and do that. But after I got these results, there's no way I will ever do that again. But that's, you know, I'm talking about I will never pump water again from my public land. So that was facetious if you got that one. So we've also detected pesticides in the soil. So 6 out of the 13 soil samples were we detected restricted again and banned pesticides. The one thing I would mention in this is that when we detected these pesticides, what we found in the soil samples when we do this transects is that these cultivation sites have been used year after year after year. So we would detect chemical 1 up at the top, chemical 2 in the middle, and chemical 3 at the bottom. The next year, huge significant rain event will occur. Those chemicals will move. And we would see it in the soil, like, wow, we never detected chemical 1 at the top, now it's in the middle or the bottom. But then our water samples will then go ahead and pulse all these different chemicals, which is signifying that we now just have this layer effect, you know? Layer after layer after layer of chemicals being placed in these type of samples. Every rain event comes in and pulses it through. So even if these sites never get a grow on them, we're still detecting chemicals 3 years past grows. We're now on our 4th year in grows. So we're trying to monitor the legacy effect. This may be 4, 5, 10, 15 years before these chemicals disperse into the environment or degrade. The other thing is, too, we started working with the EPA, and EPA would state that there's no absolute way that you detected this chemical in this soil sample, because our data states that if you disperse this chemical on the ground, farmers have always found out that it only degrades in 28 days. And then the next question from myself and other toxicologists would come forward and say, well, is that in a legal regulated manner? Like, would it be 1 ounce to 1,000 gallons of application? And they said, yeah, of course. So that's what the growers are doing, right? No, they're not doing 1 ounce to 1,000 gallons. They're doing 1 liter of this chemical to a 5-gallon sprayer. And then they said, well, no one has those kinetic data. So you're right, it could be years before it dissipates. So that is the lack of scientific evidence. That is, we can't make those inferences that it's going to dissipate. So we now need to look at the potential longevity and the legacy effect that may be stemming from that. Now the next questions are grow sites and cultivators poisoning and poaching wildlife. This may seem like a very downer topic. I'm sorry, I'm seeing a lot of faces just hang their head low, but what I want to state is this is happening in California. This is happening in other states, what I've understand, that have legalized and the policy has been liberalized, okay? What I'm trying to get at is don't follow in the same environmental footprints that we're undergoing right now in California, because it's going to cost us millions and millions of dollars to try to rectify this. So we wanted to find out, again, how much wildlife is being poisoned or poached. So law enforcement discovers and reports dead wildlife discovered at grow sites. And a lot of this, bear in mind, it's law enforcement officers that are doing this, we can't expect them to be scientists, to go ahead and collect the scientific evidence out there. And just the same thing, like law enforcement should not be expecting us as scientists to go out there and enforce the law. That's why this interdisciplinary approach, a multi-platform approach in order to answer these questions objectively. But that's what we would find. Who's familiar with bighorn sheep and how many millions of dollars have been spent for endangered bighorn sheep? So that is a bighorn sheep in California that was maliciously poisoned in a grow site. And if you focus on this photo right here, that is a sow, and up here is her cub that died too. She was poisoned at a campsite grow site. We come in and we would find the cub out there poisoned as well. But also the poisoning and poaching of animals, taking out regalia or gallbladders when they're in these, because they can also make money on that side profit as well. So again, over and over, you name it, whatever species is out there, you may say, hey, mountain lion poisoned? Yes. Or what birds are poisoned out there have you found? Yes, we found so many. The other thing is growers will also record their wildlife that poison or poach. It's pretty amazing. I know this is, for me, was amazing, but for law enforcement, they're like, yeah, we find that all the time. They're criminals. They don't realize that. Don't take photos of their crime scenes. But they do that, and we would look through the point-and-click cameras and be just absolutely amazed what we find. So this is a cultivator in his pot farm holding a golden eagle that he shot. Okay. The other thing that's what people don't realize is these cultivators are out there February, March, April, and May. That's the time when they're poaching big time to supplement their food. That's also the time when elk and deer are dropping fawns. Or cows. So that's the thing that we're finding out is when we go into these sites, this is a picture from a point and click where the individual cut a doe up and then found the fetus in there. So we're not talking about just poaching the doe, we're talking about poaching and removing other generations of wildlife as well. And it's pretty amazing. So this is a public land. This is the cultivators. Multiple long guns, multiple handguns standing over their quarry. And I'm supposed to send a crew out there at night to go hoot for owls when I have this. And that's what worries me, is that one time one of my crew members or one of my colleagues' crew members is not going to make it back while they're out there working on an animal for the public trust on their public lands. So what we found was a total of 90 dead animals that were discovered out of 85 sites. 46 out of those were where we detected dead wildlife. Now here's what the number of shot wildlife that we found was 47. So that is a massive buck for California. And that buck was shot, that bear was shot, you can see the entry wound. And so we would take a lot of these samples back and we'd take them back to our forensic lab at UC Davis. My wife, Dr. Wengert, she also does forensic work. And so we would look at stuff like that and we would find, and we would look at the differences between trauma that was ante or post-mortem, and we would determine, yes, that was an ante-mortem wound. And that deer was shot by pellet rifles. That's one thing that we find constantly. These individuals take air rifles and poach deer left and right. Number of suspected poisoning is 24, and the number of confirmed poisoning is 19. Now, a lot of folks were saying, well, you're talking about all of these chemicals, and why aren't you finding piles and piles of dead animals in a grow site? And I give you an occurrence, an instance that kind of would illuminate why we're not finding that much wildlife. Do you remember the North Korean's dictator's half-brother who just got dosed with VX gas that died in the airport? He was dosed with, I believe it was 23 or 28 times the lethal dose of VX gas. VX gas is a highly potent organophosphate. The most toxic carbamate that we found, or organophosphate we find out there, is about a fraction of the lethality that VX gas can do. He, even though dosed over 20 times the amount of lethal dose, was able to live for 19 minutes and walked in that airport for over a mile, going back and forth trying to find help. So think about it. If a black bear gets dosed a lethal dose and he's going to die in about 5 minutes, how far can a black bear run for 5 minutes? And that's the type of evidence we're using to say, you know, this dosing or suspected is probably grossly underestimation of what's occurring out there. So I started doing some casual interviews with growers and asking them the question, and I asked them, like, you know, how do you view wildlife? And what they said, that they saw them as a pest or food item. They shot wildlife because they were bored. How they approached it is they just shot at them. They placed poisons on the marijuana plants or native plants to discourage plant damage. So look at this photo. If you look at it, that's an Aquafina water bottle with a Pepsi can that's cut in half and a toothbrush. Again, toothbrush, Pepsi can, water bottle. What we would find at the bottom of these plants, the bottom of these plants would be painted with the toothbrush and the pink stuff. And then we would find dead animals. They would also place poisons on raw food. Bear in mind, a lot of these chemicals I'm talking about are systemic. So when you put it on the plant, what they're doing is to get that plant so highly dosed with that poison so that a browser like an elk or a deer that comes in there and nibbles on that plant is going to die. And that will get rid of that pest. Now, we started testing these plants and we started getting tons and tons of banned or restricted chemicals in these plants. Now, the next question is, which we're not answering, but we're just going to provide the data, that's what these plants are contaminated with. Now, what does that mean when a consumer goes ahead and ingests it or volatilizes it? So carbofuran is that pink stuff that we find constantly at grows. It's banned for illegal use in the United States, Canada, or the European Union. It's banned for its high toxicity to humans and the environment. And as I mentioned, a 1/4 teaspoon can kill an African lion, 1/8 of a teaspoon can kill a 300-pound black bear, and 1/16 of a teaspoon can kill you. And we're finding 5 gallons, 1 liter, multiple 1 liter bottles constantly out there. So this is what carbofuran does to wildlife. And this has been documented extensively in Africa. So this is an African lion. So exactly what they do in Africa, and exactly what they do in Central America, is they put carbofuran in food product, like a tuna can. And you place the tuna can out there, the animal consumes it, and then you got rid of your problem. We didn't know about this until I started with other scientists wondering, why are tuna cans out in the middle of these grow sites? The camp is about a half a mile to a mile away, and all these plant plantation sites were finding these tuna and sardine cans. So I started looking at them, and I couldn't find any residuals. So we started taking samples, swabbing them, and lo and behold, they're booming with carbofuran in there, which means that they're placing it out there. But again, bear in mind, we started seeing this, and I'm touching them with nitrile gloves, but the law enforcement officers many times in instances would pick them up and say, hey, what do you think this is, Murad? And they're wearing nothing, okay? That is the risk as well. So the trends of carbofuran over the years, we started getting this data. We don't know what happened previously to 2012, but you can clearly see here, 2012 to right now, we're at 55% of sites in 2016. 2017, we're probably now at 75 to 80% of all cultivation sites have this chemical. They're realizing this. They're realizing that if you put tons and tons of chemicals out there, law enforcement is not eradicating these plants because of the high risk to human health and safety. So let's load them up. We find sites that have plants that look like they've been flocked, the flocking that you do for a Christmas tree. That's what it looks like. They're just flocked with these chemicals. And I won't even go through it. Even though I have the PPE to go through it, I will not walk through a plantation like that. And I would advise against it, but I'm seeing law enforcement walk right through it sometimes because it's just, we got to get rid of these plants. And to me, I personally would like to go back home to my family at the end of the day. So what about water use rates for sites? What's great is the Humboldt County Growers Association came out with this. And they're really backpedaled off of this. They're like, no, we overestimated. I'm sorry, we apologize. What they said was a plant takes 6 gallons a day. From seed to a harvestable product is 50 days with 900 gallons per plant per season. So I started looking at it and going, really? This, I know based off of other plant studies that when you have evapotranspiration, local climate, plant health, because you're growing out in the wild, and the bug damage that exacerbates water use. So is this realistically the amount of water that is needed for a plant that's supposed to have no pesticides on it? And it's most not likely. And what we're finding out, and look at this, a great example is look at that pot plant. That pot plant is right in just rocks, essentially. We're finding out it takes 9.5 gallons per plant in these situations for a total of 1,400 plus gallons per plant per season. So when you take this and you look at what's going on in California. Now, I'm going to give you numbers here, and bear in mind, these numbers are only the plant numbers that have been eradicated off of public lands. So this is not private land cultivation. 2012, 870,000 plants. And you can see it climbs up to, in 2015, over 500,000 plants, but 912 million gallons of water just for that. 16, over 1 million plants, 1.3 billion, 1.43 billion, which is equivalent to about 1 to 2 months of the city of San Francisco household use of water. And that's over 1 million plants. 2017, what law enforcement has eradicated from public lands is at 1.28 million plants. So it's higher than that now. It's going away, folks. It's getting better. That's what we've been told. So the other thing is, remember that 150 days? Now, do you think a cultivator, when they're growing, is after they harvest their product, they're going to go hike up to that creek and turn off the water valve, pull that pipe out? That doesn't occur. So a good example was, this is a site that had 7 lines at 8 gallons per minute. That was over 3,000 gallons per hour for a total of 29.4 million gallons a year. That's one site. Because we have to now start looking at our calculations for this, it's not going to be 150 days, it's 300 plus days for what they leave out there. So here's a video that shows, this is trespass grow sites in the state of California using DCEP data. And so this is what's showing how many we have out there. And we have to bear in mind the caveat that law enforcement actually only detects, and this is actually a very, very liberal amount of 20 to 50% of all sites. So look at that. Look at all of those dots out there. And if law enforcement's only detecting 20 to 50% of all the public land cultivation sites. Now, out of those, only 10 to 20% are reclaimed. What I mean by reclaimed is cleaned up. So that right there, imagine only 10 to 20% of those dots are removed because they're cleaned. But that means that we have 90 to 80% out there that are chock full of chemicals. So with all of this, we're showing the problem. I want to show you guys some of the solutions that we're working on. This is the final portion of this talk. Is what we've been coining is a trident approach. Is we need to have an interdiction on this. Is preventing and establishing of sites. Because what we have right now in California is more of a reactive versus a proactive. When you have one national forest that is the budget for national forest, law enforcement officer is one officer. One conservation officer to monitor 200, 300 miles of road, multiple campgrounds, and then has to deal with fires, homicides on that forest, and they're supposed to now start monitoring to make sure no growers are coming on that forest. That's how understaffed and underfunded law enforcement is in California. And so we're looking at, well, let's not have a reactive, let's be proactive. And let's stop it from going in. But of course, we have to be realistic and honest and say we're not going to stop it all from establishing. So let's try to then have the support and budget to enforce and disrupt these sites that sneak in from in the cracks and fall in between the cracks. And then finally, removing the sites. That's a key thing. So we have data now where we have gone into sites, and I'll show this later on, is if you remove all the infrastructure at a site, we have a 0% reoccupation rate. The other thing is, too, we're working with DEA and working with HIDA and U.S. Forest Service. We're creating a model. So this is a computer algorithm model. What we're trying to look at is all the variables, and we're developing a model that has a high predictability of where areas that grow site will be occurring. And it's a conservation use. That's what we're using it for. So if we have grow sites, and if you look at some of this, all these little dots, the purple dots are where the grow sites are, but the red are areas where there is no grow sites, but the predictive model basically says there's a 95% chance that there's a grow site there. And so with that, we're also ground truthing. So a model is only as good as you are, it's almost armchair quarterbacking. But what we've done is then send our science teams out to these sites to ground truth. So we go ahead and look at low, moderate, and high areas. And out of those high areas, instead of finding one grow site, we're finding an average of 2 to 3 grow sites now in those high areas. And the reason why we asked law enforcement, we have grow sites in these drainages, did you guys ever know about that? And they said, we can't. We only have 5 days of airtime. And in those 5 days of airtime, I'm only going to be covering this little area. I cannot cover this area in 5 days. So therefore, all those other grow sites are just going to be established. Again, the reclamation, the cleanup portion of it. Historical, law enforcement go in there. After eradication, we may have 1 or 2 more hours of blade time. Then let's go ahead and do some sling loads and nets and co-binders and get some of this stuff removed. So what we're finding out, there's little to no time for a site assessment and the reclaimed site visits when we go in. What we consider reclaimed, we're finding that all the sites either had trash or food or other infrastructure and chemicals, and the dams were present. So really, these sites had a 50 to 70% success only. So 50% of the trash to as little as 30% of the trash and infrastructure was there. Now, when we've done the economic cost, it's about $30,000 to $50,000 to clean up a whole site. That's how much, not our effort, but that's how much it costs to establish a site. When law enforcement does these 50 to 70% reclamation efforts and leaves some pipe behind, it takes $5, a couple rolls of duct tape, or upwards of $3,000 to reestablish that site. because you just need some line, some couplers, you're good to go. We leave them dirt, and that's what we've been seeing that works. So new protocol, what we do, we're leaving them dirt, and when we go back out there to reassess, an independent team goes out there, we tell them, find trash, and they're finding 3 to maybe upwards of as little as 1% of trash out there, and it's working. So from 2014 to 2017, we have cleaned 139 grow sites. That's 44 major complexes over a huge amount of land. We have 0 injuries, 0 documented exposure to toxicants. But the one thing I want to state in there is that we have 0 reoccupation in those 139 grow sites. We went and visited 20 grow sites that state enforcement has done and 20 grow sites that federal law enforcement has done. And out of those 40, about 50% of them have been reoccupied after 2 years. Essentially is about the time period. Because they got busted, let's give law enforcement another year, they won't recon that area because they'll consider it clean, and they reestablish. Because it takes only $5 to $3,000 to reestablish. But if you leave them nothing, and it's going to cost them $30,000 to $50,000, think about a DTO, a drug trafficking organization. You just basically left their 5 complexes dirt. That means they're going to have $150,000 to reestablish, versus what's $5,000 to $10,000 for them? Nothing. But you really hurt them in their pocket. And for us as a scientist and a conservationist, I look at, hey, we're getting rid of that problem out there in our landscape. That is an infographic that shows you what that means. 165,000 pounds of trash. And if we look at the water use, we've freed up over 250 million gallons of water. An irrigation line, I know this is pretty much irrelevant, but from Eureka to Hopland, that's where I live at, nearby. But 126 miles of irrigation line that we removed. Think about that, that's a lot. But bear in mind, guys, is that when I talk about what happens in California, we have just in a 4-year period, I said that 2014 or 2009 to 2014, 4 or 5 year period, we have 2,200 grow sites in California. If only 10 to 20% of those are cleaned. Annually, there's about 250 to 300 grow sites that occur on U.S. Forest Service lands annually. And if we go with the caveat that law enforcement detects at maybe upwards of 50, now we're seeing annually, we probably have about 500 to 600 sites. And we only are removing 10 to 20% of that. So you can see the amount of chemicals and trash that's being deposited over and over and layering on our public lands. Now, final slide. This is what a grow site looks like. We fly. And so you can see potholes, all of those. That's a 5,000 plant grow. You can see how close each pothole is. This is a creek that's been completely dewatered, trash there, chemicals everywhere. That's just a typical grow site. I'm not picking out the worst of the worst. It's just like this is the one that I could actually fly the drone in. But here we have bears. We put up cameras. There's 4 bears sleeping in this trash with all these chemicals. You know, they're interacting with all of these chemicals. And here, where this bear is going to walk to, is a bottle of pink carbofuran. So, you know, that bear actually bit into that carbofuran. We never found that bear. But when you have partnerships and stakeholders that are invested in this, this is what success looks like. You leave them dirt. You leave them nothing. And the other thing is you bring Forest Service, law enforcement officers, we bring counter drug, the military, the National Guard in. We have NGOs like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation. All of these folks are coming out there and taking a vested interest in that. And it's a very key component of success, because when they go out there and remove this, then they go out to their communities and they can say, this is not acceptable. I did not know this was occurring in my backyard and in areas where I would recreate in. This is not acceptable. So with that, I don't know if I have time for questions. So the first question is, what is the impact and contamination of the marijuana itself from the rodenticides? are the uses of marijuana, the users of marijuana being exposed? That's a great question. So, for rodenticides, no one has tested whether or not plants can take in the rodenticides. That would be a great project to do. But we do know that we have detected numerous restricted or banned chemicals in the plants themselves, and dried product as well as the uncut product as well too. And if people say, well, you're only testing trespass cultivation sites, unfortunately, we've also tested private grows where law enforcement officers come in, and it's a day. I'm inserted to a entry team for a week, and so maybe 3 days out of that week we're doing trespass grows, and the other 2 days I'm going in with law enforcement to private cultivation sites. I'll still test that plant, and then I have also detected pesticides in those. So we have the data that doesn't demonstrate this is only occurring on trespass or forest grows. We have also data that private grows have contaminated plant products. But as Sergeant Gerhardt said, it's going to be self-regulated, and that will weed itself out. And then next question is, a few years ago, back when there was a serious drought in California, was there talk about marijuana water use during this crisis? Yes, it actually was. But one of the counter arguments that we received constantly was, and it's a deflection process that I don't even entertain, I don't even address, I'll ignore someone who ever brings that up, is, well, it's really an 8-year-old argument, is, well, it may be bad, but the soybean farmers are worse. Or that is the counter argument we would get. And I would just go, I'm looking at a death by 1,000 cuts, and that's my approach. And yes, I can try to be a master of all trades, or I can be a jack of all trades, and I become a master of this trade. And that's what my focus is on this. I'll let somebody else focus on the other products, and I'm focusing on the environmental damage from marijuana. The pro-pot audience argues that if we legalize recreationally marijuana, it will take care of the problems you have discussed with these illegal grows. How do you respond to this argument? That's a great question too, and I get that constantly. And what I state is, if you look at plant count numbers in California, and increases of exposures to different wildlife species, the plant count numbers have corresponded with previously to Proposition 215 in 96, they were stagnant. Then after 215, they skyrocketed up. As after SB 420, they went up, they skyrocketed up as well. And then since, for us, we don't have that long of a data set, but at least the plant counts are up, the amount of sites on trespass areas or public land areas or trespass cultivation sites have also boomed in those time periods. So again, if we are liberalizing policy and you have almost a lack of complete law enforcement presence and regulating or monitoring sites in California, it should go away. But that's not the data we're showing. And if you look at the exposure rates of animals should be a sentinel, and we're clearly demonstrating that this temperature gauge is showing that the temperature is elevating. The chemical carbofuran, is it found in the tuna cans? Yes, we find it in tuna cans. So if you've done eradication, some law enforcement agencies will pick up toothbrushes at campsites for DNA evidence, and we started testing those, and we find those to be positive for carbofuran. And so they're not brushing their teeth, it just is a toothbrush that they've been using. So we find it in everything, tuna cans, water bottles, sleeping bags. So that's the other thing is too, what we teach for law enforcement, our safety. So I go to FLETC and I teach, so that's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. So I teach over there as an instructor. I teach for different Narcotic Officers Association. And one of the things we're now bringing to folks is, you have a contaminated area. You have a suspect who doesn't wear PPE. You are now apprehending that suspect, and you have now detained that suspect, and that suspect is now going to go in your vehicle. And if you are not decontaminating that vehicle, and then what a lot of my friends do who have children, their kids go in there and play with the lights, and when they're at home, it's pretty cool to have these lights and the sirens go on. You're a 5-year-old kid. Now your kid is interacting in a seat that may be potentially contaminated. These are all questions we are now bringing up so that folks can make good, sound decisions. Because for me, at the long game and the long run of this game is I want each and every LEO officer out there to be safe and healthy, because the safe and healthy population of law enforcement officers working on this means that you guys can go out there and address this to get this rid on our landscape, so then I can go ahead and not use my payment of my student loans from marijuana research that I'm doing. That's not what I went for my PhD, but it's a very front and center conservation issue now. Do you get support from the Sierra Club? That's a good question. So early on, honestly, people would ask me that question, and I would see members of various advocacy groups, environmental advocacy groups, and I would say, I have not yet. We have a donation button, and 99.9% of our funding comes from public funding through state or federal grants. I think we have received since 2004 $150 in donations, and that's all been from private citizens. We have not received anything from any of these advocacy groups, but you have to also look at some of these advocacy groups and some of their executive directors have actually switched over and started working for marijuana industries as well. I think very similar to what Sergeant Gerhard was talking about for some of the law enforcement officers. We've seen that as well. It's also a very sore subject to bring up, especially potentially if some of your donations for your advocacy group are being brought in from that industry as well. So we always invite folks from everybody to come in and check out a grow site. If you want to see it, and we are having a media day with law enforcement, let's go out there and just see a grow site. So we do that. But yeah, we do get some media response from these groups, but again, it could be one-sided. How many DTOs are facilitating the grow sites? For example, are there drug cartels that are predominantly the cause of hundreds of different individual independent growers, or are just independent growers? That would be mostly law enforcement agencies could probably answer that better. But what I have done or what I've seen is these individuals do have Santa Muerte, MS-13 tattoos, and we find them. I mean, they're out there. These guys have Jesus Malverde candles and paraphernalia out there, so they have money placed out in shrines, and so it is worrisome because that's not my forte, and that's not something I would have. If I were to work in Syria, if I were to work in El Salvador, I can definitely see that, but I would have never thought that I would be worried that there's a potential that myself or my crew could be seriously injured or killed doing work on our federal public lands. And many of you may not even know, but right after 2012, when we published that first paper, a group of individuals came into our backyard and poisoned and killed my dog. So it's front and center. I mean, I know it. I know that risk. So that's happened. And if you go to some of the blog sites, there's GPS lat longs, and snitches end up in ditches. My face, my kids, their photos have been posted. So it's just an inherent risk in this work, but I look at it and go, we can either cower to it or present the scientific truth to rectify this. Thank you. So last question is, how can harvesters or hunters detect or test for contaminants in their animals? So there's no field test, unfortunately. What you actually have to do is take a piece of liver and piece of muscle tissue and submit those to the lab, and then they'll run those tests. So that can take a month, 2 months. It depends on your lab that you have to do it with. So if you're like me, you submit the samples and you eat your mountain quail, and then you go ahead and regret that. But that's something we have to be honest about, and that's something why the Mule Deer Foundation, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, California Black-tailed Deer Association is, I mean, these are partners now working with us, because when we publish this paper, it's in review right now, that says game in California contaminated from marijuana cultivation sites. I mean, what does that mean? When you go ahead and you have an agency that's stewarding your public trust, your public, for that wildlife, and we don't have a grip on it, and we have animals out there that are being harvested and consumed by responsible hunters and exposed to these toxicants. I mean, what does that mean? That opens up a huge can of worms. Well, thank you so much.